Okay, so for the second half of this morning's presentations, I'm delighted to welcome sociologist and historian Dr. Terry Dunne. Terry was Laois Historian in Residence from 2021 to 2022 and has a PhD in sociology from Maynooth University. Terry has published in the journals Critical Historical Studies, Era Ireland, Sayre, Rural History and History Ireland. He is co-editor of the forthcoming publication Spirit of Revolution Ireland from Below, 1917 to 1923. Terry researches and narrates the podcast Peelers and Sheep, and the title of his talk this morning is Finding Women in Rural Labour History.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to say at the start that I'm honoured to be on such a distinguished panel, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. I'd like to say how impressed I am at the event and how many people have turned out on a Thursday morning. I must admit, coming down, I was sceptical, but it's a credit to the organisers. Now, I'm kind of the black sheep of the proceedings, because I'm actually not going to be talking about Waterford. Yeah. I'm going to be talking about women in rural labour history more broadly, particularly drawn on my own research, which is about areas more to the north of here. That, if you remember Emmett's talk, he was talking about how in 4 counties there was a ratio of 2 labourers to every 1 farmer, if I got that statistic right. One of the counties was Waterford, and the other 3 were Dublin, Kildare and Meath. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Dublin, Kildare, Meath, Carlow, Laois, but kind of general stuff that's analogous over a broader area of the country. And when Waterford is different, sorry. And when Waterford is different to that, I'll be making a direct reference to how Waterford might be different. Now, and as well as that, I suppose my talk is kind of a personal journey about writing women and into labour history, because one of the great strengths, I think, of the Decade of Centenaries, and bear in mind I'm usually a person that gripes about the Decade of Centenaries and public history in general, and how the history of the working class movement is left out of it. One of the great strengths of the last 10 years has been writing the history of women and back into it, and it's a kind of an imperative put on all of us. So I kind of started out on this journey because the local union where I'm originally from was founded in the townland next over to where my father grew up, yeah, and where I lived the first month of my life. But I never heard about it, and kind of like what Emmett was saying, I was kind of amazed by this and wanted to learn more, yeah. And then I was fortunate enough to become Laois Historian in Residence, so under the Decade of Centenaries programme, so I did more research as part of that. Now, I'm going to start off today with a banner, okay? This, I believe, is the earliest surviving farm labourers banner in Britain or Ireland, yeah? Now, the union that was in Britain at this time, the National Agricultural Labourers Union, as far as I know, this is from the 1870s, as far as I know, there are no surviving banners from that union. Emmett might know better, so maybe I'm not 100% there, right? But this is a very, very old and very rare thing to have, yeah? And it's not actually specifically a farm labourers union as such, it's a general labourers union, okay? But there was always a kind of crossover, and as you can see, they've framed themselves in terms of agriculture, so I think it's safe to assume there was a lot of agricultural workers in this organisation, yeah? And it's appropriate. You'll see this was from the 19th century, the late 19th century, so it's part of the kind of phase known as labour nationalism, where local unions were set up in the wake of the Fenian Amnesty campaign after the 1867 Rising, yeah? And you'll see the nationalist element of it there in kind of ecumenical nationalism in the both Daniel O'Connell and Wolfe Tone are represented on the banner. But for our purposes today, I guess the important thing about the banner is that both men and women are represented, yeah? Though both men and women are represented, and another thing to note actually is it's the Drogheda labourers, yeah? Which is not that surprising because often it was the case that farm labourers would live in towns and go out to the countryside to work, yeah? So yeah, men and women are represented in this banner, which is appropriate for this talk. But does but there's also evidence there of how female status was devalued in that society. I'm kind of wondering if anyone wants to look at the detail and pick up on how that might be so.
Children are recognised as well.
Uh-huh.
She's got no implements.
Is she a she?
Nowadays you wouldn't know.
Well, it's been suggested there's an interpretation of this banner that that's actually a male child dressed as a female from back in the day of the practice of dressing boys in girls' clothes because of the belief that it would be boys abducted by the fairies, not girls, because boys were more valuable. Yeah. Now, that might be something we'd laugh at today, but these were real beliefs at the time. Yeah. And so that's one element of it. And another element of it actually is I think it's this man. It's the man that's doing the more skilled work. Yeah. So this is a division that we'll see. Sorry. Right. So there were gendered social roles in farming. Okay. Now, generally, it was seen as women who would be in the yard, right? So yard production is pigs, poultry, dairy, right? Men were seen as out in the field, okay? This isn't actually true. There will be women in the field as well, as we've just seen, but women in a more subordinate role, right? You're more likely to find women in arable production as opposed to pastoral production, okay? So as the 19th century goes on, you have a switch from arable production to more pastoral, a switch from corn to horn, and in that there's less of a role for women, okay? Herdsmanship was very seen as dirty, dangerous, masculine work, right? Now, there's an exception to that, which we have to be bearing in mind in this part of the world, which is dairying, and which Emmett has already referred to, right? Another issue is casual as opposed to permanent workers, okay? You have maybe permanent male farm labourers, yeah, but then there's a big pool of temporary workers who are brought on for specific tasks, like the harvest, yeah? Because the way agriculture works is there's specific times of the year where there's need for a lot of labour, right? I believe now that this was often actually whole families together, yeah, and I think maybe older people in the audience might have recollections of how that worked, or have heard from their parents how that worked, so I'd like to hear of it. But as I said, dairying cuts across that, so you would have had dairy maids who were permanent paid employees, yeah. There's also the question of what is a farm labourer, right? Because domestic servants which is very much a female occupation and the major source of wage labour for female workers in rural Ireland at this time. Domestic service is generally seen as something separate from farm labouring, but in fact, if you were a domestic servant in a farming family, you would have been involved in farm tasks as well, particularly in the yard production, the pigs, poultry, dairy, and so on. And I should say as well, when I'm talking about yard production, like this isn't a small thing, yeah? Annually in the run-up to 1914, something like 9% of Irish agricultural exports were eggs, yeah? And when you look at, there was these things, and older people would remember, I think they were wound up in the 1980s, the County Committees of Agriculture, which were kind of like a cross between the ETB and Teagasc. And in the early days, a lot of their focus of their work in terms of improving Irish agriculture was focused on what went on in the yards, butter making, dairying, pigs, poultry and so on. So what went on in the yard might have been seen in the society often as just a woman's pin money, but was actually more important than that. Now, and the other thing that was important about the yard is where in the field a woman might be in a subordinate position. In the yard, it wasn't just that she was the most important worker. A lot of the time she was autonomous. I'm talking more about the farmer's wife here now. She was autonomous, and this was an income that she controlled. So that's important also. Very important. Now, so as I say, I'm mostly going to be talking about the Midlands. My examples are mostly going to be from the Midlands, but this is kind of the general stuff. And just to fit this in, it's very much analogous with what it's very similar pattern to what the earlier speakers were saying about what was going on in Waterford. So Pat's description of Waterford in 1922 very much fits Meath and Kildare in 1919. The blockades and the passes and the support of other workers such as dockers, yeah? And so that was the big event there. And then the other big event in 1923 was the Athy lockout. And basically, the Athy lockout was the trailer to the main feature being in Waterford, okay? As I say, Darien would have brought in a slightly different gender dimension. This is a picture of, it's interesting actually how women might be there even if you can't necessarily see them. It's an interesting picture of farm workers from South Kildare in 1919. There's a couple of interesting things about it. One that would be of interest to you in particular, Pat. If you can see a couple of them, the hats they have on are British Army caps, so presumably someone in the family was in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, but also it's actually quite rare, not only as an example of early photography, but early photography taken by a woman. And it was Miss Jackson was these people's employer, which was unusual, but not unheard of. So, anyways, yeah. So, as I was saying, there was a lot of female wage labourers in the pool of casual labour, yeah, as opposed to the permanent farm workers. And in 1919, when the strike begins in Meath and Kildare, and I should say the strike begins with a lockout against the transport union, which they then escalate into a strike. And there's more or less immediately in South Kildare, there's the rumour that the male workers are going to be replaced with the labour of women and the labour of children. Yeah. Now the transport union, the local transport union, announces that lockout benefits are going to be extended to any woman who refuses to take the jobs of locked out men. How practical that was, I do not know, but the initial phase, there was 122 men locked out and 23 women. Those numbers would have changed a lot. It would have grown and got smaller because, as Pat was saying, one of the tactics was to make individual settlements with one farmer and then use that to put pressure on the next one. Yeah. About 2 weeks later, there's this incident where farmers start to employ women thinning turnips. Yeah. That's again, older people may remember this. This is this not very pleasant work where you crawl along the ground, pulling up the smaller plants, and getting very wet knees as you do it, and pain in your back. I imagine, fortunately I can only imagine, that's actually men doing it in England in the 1940s, is the only picture I could get relevant. But apparently, and I'm quoting one of the farmers now, weeding was always regarded as women's labour, and he gave a guarantee that they would not interfere with men's work. Yeah. So again, this is this pool of temporary labour, and for this specific task at a specific time of the agricultural calendar, you're bringing in women from the nearest town. Yeah. as it happened, the transport union decided the next day that the strike did not apply to this form of work. Yeah, so this form of work went ahead. Then another place one often sees women, and I think this is true of social movements generally in past decades, is when there's any bit of a ruckus or a riot. Yeah. In one case in Athy, as we go into August 1919, where one farmer who is part of the strike is delivering oats to a funeral director by the name of Rigney. The transport of oats is going through the town. It's actually stopped, and Rigney turns it back as it's coming back through the sacks of oats are slit. The oats are spread all over the streets, and the what do you call it again? The tailgate of the trailer ends up in the canal, and specifically, it's this kind of more kind of riotous behaviour. The newspapers specifically refer to the role of women in this. There wasn't that much of that went on, different to what Pat was saying as regards what was going on here in 1922, yeah. There would have been a few incidents though, particularly in the town of Athy and also in one place in Meath. And there's actually a whole back history to do with the particularly riotous disposition of people from that town. Anyways. Then one other place where you see women in the strike was women in a tobacco processing facility in Randallstown, County Meath, joined in with the strike. They were in like a sort of tobacco factory, and the farm it belonged to was already on strike. Not as unusual as people might think, tobacco was growing again here in the 1930s. I don't know if you grew it in Waterford, but it would have been grown in Wexford and Kildare. Okay, someone's nodding, so it was grown in Waterford as well. And that's ever the man, the rather large farmer that ran that operation. So then another place where you come across women's involvement in the local labour movement is nationally prominent women coming down to speak at rallies. Yeah. So one of these I would have come across in my research on County Laois that I've been very blessed to be doing as part of the Decades Continuous programme, was Sissy Cahalan. I keep calling her Sissy Cahalan, but I actually know from Margaret Ward she only went by the name Cahalan. Yeah, I find it very strange to just be referring to people by their surname though. That's her there in the middle with the rest of the leadership of the Irish Union of Distributive Workers and Clerks, which I think is now mandated. Basically, it was the union for shop workers. So this was one union where you would have had women in a leadership role, a particularly female occupation. Other unions that you would have seen this in would have been more textile workers and more based in the north. So Cahalan would have came down to Laois in June 1922, talked as part of the Labour Party election campaign in that year. It's very, it's worth remembering, I think, in regards to that election campaign, what you would have heard from the platform, I think, was very much further to the left than you would have heard from any election platform, I would say, in Ireland for many decades afterwards, if ever. Certainly from a major party, I should say. And it's interesting, her speech, like, it was June 1922. She didn't, and this again goes back to what Emma and Pat were saying, is what people were expecting at that time. She didn't think the revolution was over in June 1922, okay? She thought it was going to continue on and to a new plane, shall we say. Now, the Irish Union of Distributive Workers and Clerks, one of the main things that they focused on was the living-in system, okay? This is where shop workers lived above the premises, yeah, and above the shop premises, and they would have felt that this opened them up to living into inferior conditions, and also sometimes dangerous conditions. There was a number of cases where there was fires in shops, and shop workers lost their lives as a result. So this is just the square where Catlin gave her speech, and just to give you an example of what the living-in system was like, and I'm sure that this was the same in Dungarvan and other towns in Waterford. This shop here, the Williams, the shop is still there. It's no longer a shop, but the building is largely intact. There was 11 workers living in that shop, yeah? And it was only a standard shop, like sold clothes and groceries, like it wasn't, you know, I don't know, Homebase or Woodies or IKEA or something. Yeah, 11 shop workers and 2 domestic servants, yeah? That's, as I said, the main waged employment for women in rural Ireland at this time was domestic service. But often when you say domestic service, people think of the big house, yeah? But a shop would have had domestic servants. A farm would have had domestic servants. And in this case, interestingly, I would say that this would be probably quite different from what you'd find in Waterford, though people can let me know if I'm wrong. Nearly everyone was Church of Ireland, I think. Yeah, the 11 shop workers, I think there was only one Catholic. The shop owners were also Protestant, and the 2 domestic servants were Catholic, however. So you can see a kind of I mean, there were all kind of hierarchies. You know, there's class hierarchies, gender hierarchies, confessional hierarchies, right? And she wouldn't have been the only kind of nationally prominent figure that we would have had visiting this area. Nora Connolly, James Connolly's daughter, came down to give a speech in Carlow in February 1919. It's an interesting speech. Because I think it's an interesting speech because her appeal was very, maybe we might think of it now as very kind of traditional, yeah? Because one of the ways she was appealing to women was she was appealing to them as mothers, okay? Because it was going to be like, right, one day you're going to leave the formal workforce, yeah? But as a mother, you have to join the union to make sure that things are better for the next generation growing up, do you know? So it's very much a kind of an appeal to kind of traditional, to what people might be thinking of traditional gender roles, yeah? So that's kind of all one way of looking at women in rural labour history and trying to find women in rural labour history, right? And I should say that, like, methodologically, researching the working class is challenging, right? Researching the female part of the working class is extremely challenging, yeah? Because what I'm talking about here is often all you get, you know, snippets here and there, right? You get a bit more of a biography, it's a bit more of a biography of a leader, yeah? And the leaders weren't exclusively male, but more likely to be male, yeah? I mean, there's exceptions to that, like Cahill, right? But another approach that I'm particularly interested in, or is where I've kind of ended up, is to look not at wage labour, but the labour that allows wage labour to happen, okay? That in the Marxist jargon is the reproductive labour, yeah, the labour that reproduces labour power, right? Because the worker is not able to go to work unless he's fed, clothed, cared for emotionally, right? Which at this time and still is gendered as female, and is still gendered as female even if females are paid employment, right? And this, especially in this time, so this kind of became a perspective as to how to look at things in the 1970s in different directions. One in a kind of a social movement direction, in that there was an international feminist campaign for wages for housework, but also in a kind of more academic perspective, that this idea of entangled labour was developed. When the entangled labour was the academic speak for the idea that it's not just wage labour, it's a whole load of other labours that allow wage labour to happen, right? And I should say that this isn't just housework, okay? It's also subsistence agricultural production, so the kitchen garden, yeah? And it's also in cases like, say, where people are involved in, say, petty trade, okay? So going back to selling the eggs, selling the pig, right? That actually the family's work comprises of all these different elements, yeah? And how is this relevant to Ireland in the 1920s, yeah? Well, the cowless poor was one phrase I found in a newspaper. I found it in the Nina Guardian, okay? It's describing a situation where the creamery in Kilcommon, which if I remember rightly is in between Limerick and Thurles, is starting up cheese production, right? And what that means is that the poor people in that area will no longer be able to get milk, yeah? Because hitherto they would have had the milk that was left over after the butter production, right? Emma earlier was talking about the kind of impoverished conditions that people were facing, and I think it's very important to remember this. This is an aside, but cheese, by the way, was not produced commercially in this country until about 100 years ago, and this comes out of the work of the Department of Agriculture and the County Committees of Agriculture that I was talking about, and so on and so forth. Yeah, cheese, yeah, seemingly you would have only got it as a tapas with your pint in the pub. Yeah, there was no cheese being exported as it is now. It was all butter, right? But there was the cowless poor, yeah? And what this relates to is a key demand that was coming from the transport union in this period, which was for expanded cottage gardens, yeah? So people could have more of that home production that was going into their kitchen and was feeding them, that, as I said earlier, women were central to. So I just put up these houses now. People have been very familiar with the rural council cottages, I'm guessing, yeah, that were built in the run-up to this period, yeah, and I guess very familiar with the way they all have half an acre on them up to 1892 and an acre after that. So one of the demands, this one here actually is a brick from the rural council college that my father grew up in. I never lived in it. I lived in a mobile in the back garden for about a month. And you see as well, as well as building houses for people who also built using locally produced materials. That's in the local brick factory here. And so the key demand at this time was that the cottage gardens that these houses were on, that were an acre up to them, would be expanded to 4 acres, yeah? And this would allow people to keep a cow so that they would be able to have milk, as well as hitherto being able to have chickens and a pig and grow some of their own vegetables, yeah? Which was a labour that women were central to, and was also a labour which was central to the family's living standards, because, as the earlier speakers have explained, people's wages were so low. And there was a survey of the rural branches of the transport union in late 1922, early 1923, and it was this demand was what was most popular with the rural branches. But the leadership of the labour movement was not interested in it. And I think in this regard, in the lack of attention to this demand was I think there was a gendered aspect of it. I think it was a lack of attention to women in particular. I'm going to wrap up there now and put you over to Kieran. But I'll say a few concluding remarks. Is that I think one thing that it's worth bearing in mind when we look back at this period, it was probably actually this earlier period. Like most of these houses were built up until 1914, so there was about 50,000 houses built there was 50,000 houses built, and the bulk of them were between 1908 and 1914. Yeah. So in terms of where the rural working class benefited, it was actually before the revolution. And it's not, I don't actually like saying that, because in terms of what I'm politically sympathetic with, and the Irish Parliamentary Party, no, but where I look at it and I see the concrete gains, the concrete gains were made earlier. So that's one thing I think it's a sort of historical reflection. And another thing I think is the contemporary relevance, yeah. Folks, between 1908 and 1914, tens of thousands of council houses were built, yeah, over 100 years ago. And you're trying to tell me that can't be done now? I don't think so, okay? I'll leave it at that.